On November 18, 1978, a terrible tragedy took place, marking the largest loss of American civilian life in a single act until 9/11. Over 900 people, men, women, and children, died in a horrific event. They were forced to drink a deadly mix of grape-flavored drinks, Valium, cyanide, Finnegan, and chloral hydrate. Those who didn't want to drink it were either forced or shot. How did this unimaginable event happen? To understand the full story, we need to go back to where it all started, discovering the twisted path that led to this tragic day. Jim Jones was born on May 13, 1931, in rural Crete, Indiana, to Lynetta Jones and James Thurman Jones. These two couldn't have been more different from each other. Lynetta was a mix of contradictions. She often told people she came from a wealthy family, but in truth, she was always searching for someone to support her financially. She believed that in a past life, she had been a respected, powerful woman and was destined for greatness. However, the world around her never seemed to align with her dreams. Despite her big ambitions, life always seemed to stand in her way, leaving her feeling out of place in the time she lived. Lynetta had been married twice before, but neither marriage gave her the life she had dreamed of. She didn't find the right partner until she met James Jones. He came from a respected family in Randolph County, Indiana, with land, financial stability, and strong religious values. But James wasn't exactly driven. He took on odd jobs here and there, working on road crews and with cars, but he never seemed to aim for anything bigger. When World War I came, James went to fight. While in France, he was exposed to mustard gas, which damaged his lungs. He returned home a changed man, physically and mentally scarred. By the time James and Lynetta married, he was 16 years older than her. His family had given up on him ever settling down because, at over 30, it was considered late for a man to be unmarried. But Lynetta was different. Smart, quick-witted, and attractive. And James's family was just relieved that he was finally tying the knot. James's father, however, didn't believe in giving things away easily. He thought that if James and Lynetta wanted a good life, they'd need to work for it. So he gave them a down payment on a farm to get them started, hoping they would build a life through hard work. The problem was that neither Lynetta nor James knew how to run a farm, and they didn't really want to learn. Lynetta wasn't interested in hard labor, and James, having suffered lung damage from mustard gas exposure during World War I, struggled with physical work. He could barely do anything without gasping for air. They weren't cut out for farming, and their lack of interest and skills eventually caused them to fail at it. Despite getting disability checks from the government each month, Jim couldn't live off them alone. Those checks weren't enough to support a family, and the Great Depression only made things harder. Before long, they lost the farm, so they packed up and moved to a town in Indiana, where most of James's family lived. Here, Lynetta gave birth to Jim on May 13, 1931. Lynetta's in-laws helped her financially so she could raise her son. However, once Jim reached school age, Lynetta had to start working because James wasn't contributing to the household. He depended on his disability checks and said he couldn't do much else, leaving Lynetta under a lot of pressure. Jim's childhood was tough. His mother was very strict with him, even when he was just a little boy in kindergarten. She made strict rules for him to follow, like not being allowed to go inside the house after school until she came home from work. It was a harsh and unusual rule, but Lynetta stuck to it. Most of the time, Jim followed her rules, but once, when he broke one, he was punished. Even as a young boy, Jim knew how to adapt and survive. Growing up in Lynn, Indiana, he was surrounded by family, plenty of aunts and cousins, but it wasn't just them who looked out for him. The neighborhood women often took pity on him. After school, Jim would wander the town, usually trailed by stray dogs he had fed, earning him attention. The women would invite him into their homes for snacks and conversation. Jim was naturally charming and good at making people feel important. He often praised their food or found ways to connect with them. Even at a young age, he seemed to understand how to win people over, a skill that would shape his future. One woman, Myrtle Kennedy, became an important figure in his life. Her family noticed that Jim's family didn't attend church, so they took him along, walking him to Sunday school and teaching him Bible stories. Jim's parents didn't pay much attention to his whereabouts and were happy to let him stay with Myrtle's family for one summer, giving them a break. For Jim, it was a welcome escape. He cherished his time with Myrtle and their bond stayed strong throughout his life. Through her, he discovered a fascination with religion that filled an emptiness in his life. Church became more than a place of worship for him. It was where he saw the power of commanding attention and respect. He admired preachers who could keep people's attention and wanted to do the same. Driven by this desire, Jim began attending multiple churches around town, sometimes even attending 2 services in one day. People found it unusual but harmless, thinking he was just exploring his faith. For Jim, though, it was more than that. He wasn't just seeking a place to belong. He was searching for influence, admiration, and control. Over time, religion became Jim's obsession. He dreamed of becoming a pilot, doctor, or lawyer, jobs that brought success and respect. But his real goal was to lead people. He saw being a preacher as a chance to stand in front of a crowd and get their full attention, meeting his strong desire to be noticed and heard. In his neighborhood, people often thought Jim was a bit odd, but maybe he was just a kid trying to find where he belonged and how to make others see him. Jim was different from most kids. He had a strong interest in death even when he was young. He would gather dead animals he found in town, hold funerals for them, and make his friends join. At first, they thought it was a strange but harmless game, but Jim took it far too seriously. He'd stand for hours talking about the animals, and if anyone tried to leave, he'd get angry, calling it disrespectful to the dead. Even then, Jim showed he couldn't handle rejection well. His unusual behavior didn't stop there. He led a group of kids to a local casket factory, where he'd have them lie in coffins to experience death. Most kids stopped going when it got too creepy, but Jim kept sneaking in alone, lying in the coffins and pretending to be dead. While other kids in town played soldiers during World War II, Jim stood out again, this time pretending to be. It wasn't about politics. He was fascinated by his ability to control and captivate crowds. Jim mimicked that leadership style, bossing around younger kids and punishing them if they disobeyed. Jim had a crush on a girl named Sarah Lou, the daughter of a local dentist. She was pretty, came from a good family, and seemed to be everyone's favorite. But Sarah already had a boyfriend, though that didn't stop Jim. He kept showing up wherever she was, asking her to be his girlfriend. Sarah always said no, reminding him she was already with someone. Even when her boyfriend confronted Jim, it didn't bother him. One day, Sarah came home to find Jim sitting in her living room chatting with her parents. After he left, her parents couldn't stop talking about how polite and respectful he was. They thought he was wonderful, but Sarah wasn't impressed. She told them that she had a boyfriend, and she was not interested in him. Jim kept trying to win her over with his usual charm. But when it didn't work, he gave up and acted as if Sarah had never mattered to him. Rejection wasn't something Jim handled well. The summer before Jim's senior year, his mother decided it was time for a change. She packed up and moved them out of Lynn, Indiana. It turned out she'd been having an affair, and most people in town already knew about it. After the man left, Lynetta had no reason to stay, so she took Jim and moved to Richmond. Shortly after, Jim's father passed away, but neither Jim nor Lynetta attended his funeral. However, she quickly claimed his military pension. In Richmond, Jim saw the difficulties faced by minorities. He started visiting less wealthy, mostly black neighborhoods on Saturdays to talk about inequality. At first, people laughed at him, a white kid preaching about inequality, but over time they started respecting him for speaking about something they experienced daily. This was Jim's first real chance to practice public speaking, using his words to move people. Money was tight for Jim and his mom, so he got a job at Walter Reed Hospital as a night orderly. Despite being in high school, Jim managed his time by going to school during the day, doing his homework and working his night shift. Even though he didn't get much sleep, Jim managed well and earned respect at the hospital for his kindness. He had a special talent for connecting with patients, especially those no one else wanted to deal with, making them laugh and feel comfortable, even in difficult situations. It was at the hospital that Jim met a young nurse named Marceline Baldwin, known as Marcy. She was the oldest daughter of Walter and Charlotte Baldwin, a respected member of the community and a strong Republican. Marcy was passionate about helping others, often volunteering at senior homes and hospitals. Though she sometimes rebelled against her parents' views, she remained deeply religious and caring. Before meeting Jim, Marcy had planned to leave Indiana with a friend, But after meeting him, she called her friend and explained that she could no longer go to Kentucky because she had met a man and fallen in love. Even though there was an age difference, Jim's persistence and passion for civil rights, like supporting integration, won her over. Later, Marcy introduced him to her parents. Marcy's parents didn't think much of Jim at first. They thought his ideas were so extreme that some even believed they aligned with communism, and they didn't like his harsh attitude. However, Marcy was determined, and gradually they began to accept him. Jim worked hard, got involved in the church, and seemed to have his life together, so they gave their approval. In January 1949, Jim left his hospital job and moved to Bloomington, Indiana, to study law at the University of Indiana. He worked at night and took classes during the day, and on weekends he would drive back to Richmond to see Marcy. On June 12, 1949, Jim and Marcy were married in a double ceremony with Marcy's sister, but things didn't go smoothly. After they got married, Jim would stay with Marcy and her family when he came back from Bloomington. One morning at breakfast, Charlotte Baldwin, Marcy's mother, said she didn't believe in interracial marriage and thought it was a sin. Jim got very angry. He packed up their things and told Marcy that her family was terrible. He gave her an ultimatum. She could either come with him or stay, but he was leaving. Marcy didn't have much choice, so she decided to go with him. Jim wasn't someone who liked to compromise, and Marcy would later realize that this trait would lead to problems in their marriage. Soon after, Jim told Marcy something that shocked her. He told Marcy he was an atheist and didn't believe in her faith. She was shocked. She had married him thinking they shared the same beliefs, but now he was saying otherwise. Marcy even considered divorce and talked to her mother about it. However, her mother urged her to stay, saying marriage was hard but worth fighting for. In the end, Marcy decided to stay. In 1951, they moved to Indianapolis so Jim could continue studying law. There, Jim became involved with the Communist Party and started attending their meetings. At that time, it was risky to be associated with communism because of McCarthyism, but Jim wasn't afraid. In the 1950s, there was a lot of fear about communism. People worried about Russia attacking America, and many thought anyone could be a Russian spy. It was a time full of fear and suspicion. Being called a communist could ruin a person's life, and most people tried to stay out of trouble. But Jim wasn't scared of the label. He would approach government officials and try to start debates with them. They usually didn't respond, but Jim didn't care. He loved the attention. It was part of his charm, and it would stay with him for years. In 1952, the Methodist Church started focusing on progressive ideas like fighting poverty, racial equality, and prison reform, issues Jim deeply cared about. Even though he called himself an atheist, Jim saw a chance to use religion to promote his social goals. So he took a job as a student minister at the Somerset Methodist Church and began visiting black churches in the area. He felt comfortable there, appreciating the warmth and openness of the people. He admired how the congregation genuinely wanted to be there, not out of obligation. Jim invited people he met at the black churches to his church and home, asking them about their experiences with racism. He also started attending revival events and religious festivals where preachers would speak to large crowds. Faith healing was a big part of these events. Jim realized most of it was fake, relying on the placebo effect, but he saw how he could use this to attract people and make money. He didn't need any help for his mind-reading preacher act. Jim would listen in on people's conversations in the crowd, remember details, and then call them out by name on stage, repeating things he'd overheard. The crowd was amazed, thinking he could read minds. Even his wife believed it for a while because Jim kept her in the dark about his trick. She probably ignored the signs, thinking he was just finding his way back to religion after admitting he was an atheist. Through his revival appearances, Jim built a loyal following. Eventually, he was kicked out of the Somerset Methodist Church. Some say it was because he pushed for racial integration too quickly, while others believe he was caught stealing money. Either way, Jim didn't let it bother him. He wasn't in it for the title. He knew he wasn't the main pastor at the church, so he decided to start his own. Jim opened a storefront church in a less wealthy part of Indianapolis called Community Unity, with his partner Ron Halderman. Ron was a Quaker, and Jim told him he was too, claiming to have gone to Quaker schools. Ron believed him and agreed to partner with Jim, not realizing how much he was being deceived. While racial tensions in Indiana weren't as extreme as in the South, there were still equality issues. Jim used this to his advantage, gaining followers by helping the black community. He wasn't just talking about change, his church was making a difference. That's how Jim built his power. Jim had a problem with how churches talked about life after death. They told people to bear their struggles, like racism and injustice, with patience and grace, promising they'd be rewarded in the afterlife. But Jim didn't agree. He wondered, why not improve their lives now? Why wait until death? So he did something most preachers didn't. He asked his congregation, "What do you want?" He promised to help people with real problems right here and now. For example, one elderly woman had her electricity cut off because she couldn't pay the bill. Jim didn't just talk, he took action. He wrote letters, went to the electric company, and the next day her lights were back on. With Jim, it wasn't just about faith in the afterlife. He showed people they could have a better life today if they followed him. Most of Jim's followers came from poor neighborhoods, so money was tight. He needed a way to make some. Since he loved animals, he started selling spider monkeys, going door to door to offer them as pets. It was a strange way to make money, but it worked for a while. There was even a funny story about Jim's monkey business. Someone remembered seeing an ad for Jim selling monkeys. A lady whose monkey had died was looking for a replacement, not realizing that the first monkey's death might have been a sign. But Jim didn't care. He just kept selling. At the same time, Jim was becoming more popular on the revival circuit. He wasn't just attracting religious followers. Many of them also shared his political and social beliefs, so they became part of his close group. Jim convinced them that to make a real difference, they sometimes had to fake things. He called it the ends justifying the means, promising them it was all for the greater good. His fake healings were one example. He would stage events where he'd call out a cancer patient, and through a fake healing ritual, a tumor would appear. The tumor was a piece of rotten chicken liver, but Jim made it seem real, telling the congregation that if they got too close, they might catch an infectious disease. As Jim's church grew, his small storefront couldn't hold everyone anymore. So he bought an old Jewish temple and changed its name to the People's Temple. He left out the apostrophe to show that it wasn't just his church. It was for the people, by the people. At first, it seemed like Jim and his followers were genuinely driven by a strong desire to make the world a better place. In those early years, the people who joined the church were motivated by selflessness and a real passion for helping others. They saw Jim as someone who could turn hopeful ideas into real action, creating positive change in their community. What's heartbreaking about this story is that these were good-hearted people, some of the best you could find. They weren't evil or malicious. They truly believed they were doing the right thing. That's what makes the events that followed so devastating. Jim and his wife Marceline were also deeply focused on helping the elderly. They visited senior living communities and were horrified by the poor conditions they found there. Determined to make a difference, they turned their own home into a care facility for seniors. Marceline, who was a nurse, provided exceptional care, creating a warm and compassionate environment. Jim, with his charm and ability to connect with people, brought comfort and joy to the elderly. As word of their efforts spread, they took over and improved several senior care facilities in the area. This not only provided much-needed funding for the church, but also created jobs for struggling People's Temple members and boosted Jim's reputation in the community. The temple didn't stop at senior care. Jim launched several other initiatives to help those in need. He opened a free restaurant where anyone could come for a meal, regardless of their situation. They also organized clothing drives, allowing people to pick out new clothes at the restaurant. Jim set up youth programs and provided free daycare for working parents who couldn't afford childcare. At this stage, the People's Temple was truly making a positive impact on the community. However, Jim realized that if he wanted real power, he needed to step into politics. He didn't know much about politics at first, but Marceline did. She grew up around politics because of her father's influence and became Jim's guide in this area. She attended local political meetings, took careful notes, and helped prepare Jim with exactly what to say. When Jim finally showed up at these meetings, he repeated Marceline's words as if they were his own, impressing everyone with what seemed like deep political knowledge. Marceline was happy to be seen as Jim's partner, even though it's likely he didn't view her the same way. Around this time, Jim became inspired by another religious leader, Reverend Major Jealous Divine, also known as Father Divine. He was an African-American spiritual leader who called himself God and had a devoted following long before Jim came onto the scene. Jim was fascinated by how Father Divine could speak for hours without directly answering questions and still keep his audience captivated. He visited Father Divine multiple times, almost like a student learning from a teacher. This period also marked a turning point in Jim's lifestyle. He had lived modestly in the past, wearing plain, second-hand clothes and furnishing his home with mismatched used furniture. But after seeing Father Divine's mansion and sharp suits, Jim started using church donations for himself. He began wearing sleek suits and presenting a more polished image. Throughout this time, Jim's mother, Lynetta, remained by his side, fully supportive of him. She often told people about a spirit that had supposedly predicted her son's greatness. Another devoted follower was Patty Cartmel, a woman deeply in love with Jim. She believed every word he said and supported him completely, even though he never returned her romantic feelings. Jim told Patty that she was too heavy for him to consider any romantic involvement with her. However, he did make her responsible for managing his other relationships, essentially his romantic schedule. Of course, Jim didn't call it that. He had another term for it, but it's too inappropriate to mention here. At one point, Jim even tried to arrange a match between one of his daughters and Patty's son. Patty was such a loyal follower that Jim thought he could secure his legacy by connecting their families. Around this time, Jim also decided it was important to build the image of a family man. A few years earlier, he and Marceline had tried to adopt Marceline's cousin Ronnie. Ronnie had grown up in a tough situation. His mother struggled with drugs and couldn't take care of him. Feeling sorry for him, Jim and Marceline took him in. They raised him for a while, cared for him, and enjoyed having him around. Jim, in particular, enjoyed having someone to listen to him talk endlessly. After some time, Jim told Ronnie they wanted to officially adopt him, but Ronnie refused. He explained that he already had a mom and a brother and hoped to reunite with them one day. While he appreciated all that Jim and Marceline had done for him, he didn't feel the need to be adopted. Jim didn't handle the rejection well. He insisted, saying, "We want you to call us Mom and Dad." But Ronnie held his ground, repeating that he wanted to respect his mother. Marceline was deeply hurt, but Jim was furious. He felt betrayed after everything they had done for Ronnie. Eventually, Jim kicked him out and even made cruel remarks, saying, "Go back to your drug addict mother." Even after Ronnie left, Jim didn't let it go. For months, he called Ronnie, guilting him by saying things like, "You've broken Marceline's heart. She cries every day because of you." Despite the failed adoption, Jim and Marceline still wanted children. Marceline had trouble conceiving, so they decided to adopt again. This time, they welcomed a 10-year-old girl named Agnes into their home. There were rumors that Agnes was the daughter of a Native American prostitute. She was hard to connect with, moody, distant, and not very interested in others. Her attitude didn't fit the happy family image Jim and Marceline wanted to create, so they adopted again, this time bringing home 2 Korean siblings named Stephanie and Lou. It was a kind gesture as the siblings got to stay together, which doesn't always happen in adoptions. Stephanie and Lou were happy, playful kids who brought joy to the household and the People's Temple members. Not long after adopting Stephanie and Lou, Marceline finally became pregnant with their first and only biological child. Her pregnancy was difficult, so she spent most of her time resting at home. One night, while Marceline stayed home, Temple members, including Stephanie, Lou, and Agnes, went on a field trip to the Cincinnati Zoo. On their way back, the car Stephanie was riding in was hit by a drunk driver, and she was killed instantly. That night, Marceline had a strange experience. She said she woke up to a knock at the door and saw Stephanie standing there. When Marceline asked what was going on, Stephanie simply said, "Oboke needs a mommy and daddy now." Exhausted and half asleep, Marceline tucked Stephanie into bed and went back to sleep. The next morning, Jim came home after identifying Stephanie's body and told Marceline what had happened. Confused, Marceline insisted she had seen Stephanie the night before. When they checked Stephanie's room, her bed was empty. Marceline then shared the vision with Jim, including Stephanie's message about Oboke. After contacting the adoption agency, they discovered Stephanie and Lou had another sibling, a younger sister named Oboke. Whether the vision was real or something Jim and Marceline used to enhance their image is unclear. Either way, they adopted 6-year-old Oboke and renamed her Suzanne. 3 weeks later, Marceline gave birth to a baby boy they named Stephen. In 1951, they expanded their rainbow family, a term they used, by becoming the first white couple in Indiana to adopt a black child. He was a boy, and they named him Jim Jones Jr. This wasn't a random choice. Jim was making a point. By naming the child after himself, he was showing that race didn't matter to him. By this point, he had established himself as a religious leader, businessman, political figure, and family man. Yet he still wasn't satisfied. Jim wanted to make a real impact on society, particularly in the fight for racial integration. He and his followers played a major role in pushing for change in Indiana during that time. One of Jim's bold strategies involved targeting whites-only restaurants. He would show up during quiet times, introduce himself as an influential community member, and tell the staff he had a large party coming in. They'd agree, thinking it was good for business. Then Jim would bring in his black congregation. Restaurant owners would panic, but Jim would argue loudly, insisting they had agreed to serve him. He wouldn't back down until they gave in. Once they served his group, Jim would publicly praise the restaurant for being welcoming to black customers. In this way, he not only fought for integration, but also helped these businesses in the long run. Despite his controversial actions, Jim didn't seem to have many enemies. Even those who disagreed with him often found him charming and persuasive. But Jim knew that having a common enemy could unite his followers, so he created enemies and staged threats against himself. He faked assassination attempts multiple times. One time, Jim claimed someone shot at his house while he was outside. He ran inside yelling that he had been targeted. Another time, during a church lunch, gunshots were heard, and Jim dramatically fell to the ground, pretending he'd been shot. The next day, he showed up at church wearing a bloody shirt with bullet holes, telling his followers he had miraculously healed. It seemed unbelievable, but his congregation believed it. Later, many learned he had staged these events, even hiring someone to shoot blanks at him. By this point, Jim was losing touch with reality. He demanded his followers call him Father, Mother, or even Martha, depending on his mood.
Call me Father, call me Mother, call me Morphodite, call me queer.
He became obsessed with the idea of a nuclear attack. It was the 1950s, and fears of nuclear war were everywhere. Schools held drills where kids hid under desks, and people were constantly worried. Jim claimed he had a vision that Indianapolis wouldn't survive a nuclear attack, and convinced his followers they needed to leave. In 1961, he made his first trip to Guyana. He liked the country. It was small, socialist, and English-speaking. However, the political situation was unstable, so Jim decided it wasn't the right time to move. He kept Guyana in mind for the future. Back in Indiana, Jim came across an Esquire magazine article listing the best places to survive nuclear fallout. Brazil was on the list, so he decided to take action. Jim moved his family and some People's Temple members to Brazil. They stayed there for 2 years while Jim worked on setting up a new church and planning the next steps for his movement. Jim quickly realized that the missionary market in Brazil was already crowded, and there wasn't room for a new religion. This was a huge disappointment. But he couldn't let anyone see that he had failed. That wasn't an option for him. While Jim was in Brazil, his church in Indiana struggled. Membership dropped, and the progress on desegregation continued without his involvement. This upset Jim. His ego couldn't accept that things were moving forward without him. He never admitted that his trip to Brazil had been a failure. Instead, he used the assassination of President Kennedy as an excuse to return to the U.S., claiming he was urgently needed. When Jim came back, he saw how much his church had declined. This made him feel paranoid and scared of being rejected. Feeling betrayed, he decided that Indianapolis wasn't the right place for his mission anymore. He looked at an article from Esquire magazine about the best places to survive a nuclear attack and chose a new location, California. He picked Ukiah, a small town in the redwood forest. Jim gathered what was left of his followers, fewer than 100 people, and they drove to California. It was a long and tiring trip, filled with hours of church songs and I Spy games to pass the time. Ukiah wasn't like the California most people think of. It was a conservative town, full of patriotic people who supported the Vietnam War. When Jim arrived with his mostly black congregation, the locals weren't happy about it. To fit in, Jim started focusing on recruiting wealthy white people from nearby communities because he needed their money. At the same time, he reached out to society's outcasts, drug addicts, alcoholics, and people at rock bottom. He took them in, helped them clean up, gave them jobs, and made them feel like they had a purpose. These people became his most loyal followers because they believed they owed their lives to him. They would later be the ones enforcing his orders in Guyana. For 3 years, Jim grew his following in Ukiah, building a small compound. Then, another tragic event gave him a chance to take advantage of: the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. On April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. While his death had nothing to do with Jim Jones or his followers, Jim saw an opportunity. 3 weeks later, when one of the largest black churches in San Francisco held a memorial for Martin Luther King Jr., Jim gathered his followers and drove them to the event. He framed it as a gesture of solidarity, but in reality he was there to recruit new members for the People's Temple. Jim always found ways to make himself and his church seem indispensable, even if it meant exploiting a tragedy. When Jim and his followers first arrived in California in 1966, there were only 86 members in the People's Temple. By the end of the 1960s, the number had grown to 500. By 1973, Jim had 3,000 followers under his control. This period marked the beginning of the darker side of the People's Temple. Jim's talks turned into long, exhausting meetings where no one was allowed to sit. He even locked the doors to keep people from leaving or using the bathroom. People would collapse from exhaustion after working all day and then standing for hours during his preaching. Jim said it was to keep everyone focused, but it was just another way to control them. Around this time, Jim began talking a lot about reincarnation. He claimed he had been reincarnated as Jesus, Buddha, Gandhi, Lenin, and Marx. The timeline didn't even make sense. Lenin and Marx were alive at the same time, but Jim's followers didn't question it. They believed him, no matter how strange his claims were. Jim also formed a close group of trusted followers, but instead of just seeking their advice or support, he used them to spy on the rest of the congregation. He asked them to gather personal information about others, things like secrets or fears, and report back to him. Jim would then use this information to manipulate people. He would confront someone with private details about their life, and because they didn't know he had been spying on them, they thought he could read their minds. This made them trust him even more. This inner circle also became part of one of Jim's most disturbing experiments. During one meeting, Jim handed out wine to everyone and let them drink. Then he casually said, "You've all just been poisoned. You have about an hour to live." The room exploded in panic. After a while, Jim revealed he had been joking. The wine wasn't poisoned. He wanted to see how people would react. Instead of anger or rebellion, they stayed loyal. For Jim, this showed he could do something much bigger in the future. Sex also became a major way Jim controlled others. His obsession with it likely started from his troubled childhood. Even as a child, Jim talked about things he shouldn't have known about at his age. As an adult, he used sex as a tool to manipulate people. He would approach young men and women, whether they were married or not, and pressure them into sexual relationships. He would tell them it was for the greater good, and something he had to do for the cause. Many people felt they couldn't say no to him. This behavior started to hurt his marriage. Marceline had known about his affairs for a while, but she turned a blind eye as long as he kept things private. That changed when Carolyn Layton entered Jim's life. She wasn't just another affair for Jim. She became his partner in crime. She was tough and willing to go along with Jim's darker plans, something Marceline couldn't offer. Marceline was kind, but not someone Jim could rely on for his more manipulative plans. Carolyn quickly became a key member of the leadership in the People's Temple, which already included many women. What likely hurt Marceline the most wasn't just Jim's affair with Carolyn, but the fact that Jim trusted Carolyn more than her. Marceline had always wanted to be Jim's equal, someone he could rely on, but instead Carolyn became that person. Carolyn and Jim even had a son together named Chemo. Jim's biological son Stephen loved Chemo and said he tolerated the affair because of his little brother. Jim didn't try to hide the affair. It was known by everyone. He would spend nights at Carolyn's house, and she would visit his house, where the children could hear them in the other room. Carolyn had joined the People's Temple with her husband Larry, but as Carolyn grew closer to Jim, he told Larry that she was no longer his wife. Jim made it clear that he was taking her for himself, but offered another woman to Larry as a replacement. Around this time, Jim's lifestyle started catching up with him. Trying to handle his growing responsibilities, he turned to amphetamines to stay awake. But then he needed quaaludes to sleep. The constant drug use started changing his appearance. His eyes became red, puffy, and watery, so he began wearing sunglasses all the time. He claimed the glasses were to protect people, saying the power of the Lord in him was so strong that looking directly into his eyes could burn them. In reality, the sunglasses just covered up the effects of his drug use. Jim's paranoia and anxiety worsened because of the amphetamines. To maintain control, he bought a fleet of buses so his followers could travel with him everywhere. He didn't want to risk another situation where people left the church while he was away. His faith healing sessions became more elaborate. Instead of using planted members, Jim started pulling random people from the crowd claiming they had cancer. A nurse, one of his followers, would back him up, and they would perform a fake healing. They pretended to remove a cancerous lump, which was actually just chicken livers from the person's body. Jim didn't want anyone to examine the lump, so another follower would quickly grab it and shockingly eat it to make it disappear. Jim even sold photos of himself, claiming they had special powers. He sold each photo for $5 and told people they would need to buy a new one when the power faded. As time passed, Jim's ego continued to grow. He started instructing his followers to refer to him as God. He told them, "I'm God. You're God. We're all God." He dismissed the idea of a traditional sky god, labeling it as irrelevant. One day, during a service, he threw a Bible across the room, daring anyone to prove its power. When nothing happened, he pointed out that no punishment or lightning struck him. He further claimed, "If you see me as your savior, I'll be your savior. If you see me as God, I'll be your God." As time went on, Jim's followers became more educated and logical, but they still believed in his teachings. One of them, Timothy Oliver Stowen, was a district attorney in Mendocino County. Tim first came across the temple when he asked the group to help renovate the DA's office. He was impressed by their hard work and Jim's willingness to get his hands dirty alongside his followers. Tim admired Jim's commitment to equality and social justice. Eventually, Tim and his wife Grace joined the temple, and Tim became its legal counsel. Jim saw Tim's connections and intelligence as valuable and quickly brought him into the inner circle. However, Jim's demands on Tim put a strain on his marriage. Grace confided in others about how distant and overworked Tim had become. Those reports eventually reached Jim. He saw this as an opportunity to take control. He started a relationship with Grace, further weakening Tim. For Jim, seducing Grace wasn't just about power. It was also about showing Tim who was in charge. When Grace became pregnant, Jim saw the baby as a way to constantly remind Tim of his dominance. While Jim often made other women in the temple have abortions, this child, John Victor Stowen, was different. He became a symbol of Jim's power over even his closest allies. John was born on January 25, 1972, and his birth certificate listed Tim Stowen as his father. However, Jim made Tim sign an affidavit claiming Jim was the father. The affidavit said, "I, Timothy Oliver Stowen, hereby acknowledge that in April 1971, I asked my beloved pastor James W. Jones to father a child with my wife, Grace Lucy Stowen. She had reluctantly agreed, and James W. Jones, after hearing my request, agreed as well. I asked him because, despite my efforts, I couldn't father a child. I wanted my child to be fathered by someone compassionate, honest, and courageous. John Victor Stowen was born on January 25, 1972, and I am honored to raise him. I humbly accept this responsibility, hoping that he will become a devoted follower of Jesus Christ and play a role in bringing God's kingdom to earth. I declare under penalty of perjury that this statement is true and correct." This affidavit was embarrassing for Tim. Jim made him publicly admit that he couldn't father a child and had to ask Jim for help. But Jim didn't stop there. He had Marceline sign the affidavit as a witness. This was the last straw for Marceline. She had already been drained emotionally and mentally by Jim, and now he humiliated her even more. Marceline had been such a bright, strong woman before all this, but Jim had worn her down over time. She worked as a state inspector, traveling around to inspect healthcare facilities. Marceline was often away from home for a few days at a time. However, after signing the affidavit, she moved into an apartment about 60 miles away in Santa Rosa. She only came back to the People's Temple on weekends. She tried to act like the devoted wife, but those who knew her could see she had become distant. She wasn't the same person anymore. Jim, on the other hand, was more focused on other women in the temple and didn't seem to notice that his wife was still young and attractive. Then one day, Marceline told Jim she was done. She had met a psychiatrist in Georgia, and she planned to divorce him, take the kids, and start fresh there. Jim didn't answer right away. Instead, he calmly gathered the children for a family meeting and told them, "Kids, your mom wants to break up the family. She wants to leave me and take you away from this wonderful life, with the horses, friends, and family. She wants to take you away from all of this. What do you think about that?" The kids, of course, were attached to the life they knew. They loved the horses and their friends, and they didn't want to leave. So when Jim asked them, most of them said they wanted to stay with him. However, Marceline remained unconvinced. She still wanted to leave, and she planned to fight for custody of the kids. That's when Jim lost it. He started yelling at her in front of the children, threatening to kill her if she left and took his kids. Marceline wasn't scared. By then, she had figured out Jim was a fraud and didn't have the power to harm her. But when that didn't work, Jim changed his approach. He spoke in a calmer tone, warning her that if she went through with it, she would not survive. And this time, Marceline believed him. By that point, Jim had a well-armed militia, and she knew if she tried to leave, he would have her killed. Her hope for a normal life was gone. She accepted that she had to stay with Jim, and from that moment on, she became very sad and defeated. It wasn't just Marceline who suffered. Their son, Stephen, attempted suicide 3 times at the age of 12 using quaaludes his father kept in the house. Despite the attempts, Jim left the quaaludes there, showing little concern. Stephen had a hard time in the People's Temple, while his brother, Jim Jr., enjoyed his time there. It's unclear why their experiences were so different. The impact of their time in the temple shaped their lives in ways that were hard to fully understand. Remember Father Divine? We mentioned him in the last part. He was married to a Canadian woman named Edna, who took over his operations after his passing. 7 years later, Jim made his move to take control of Father Divine's congregation. He claimed that Father Divine's spirit had entered his body, and that he was now both Jim and Father Divine. Jim expected the congregation to follow him, but they weren't convinced, especially not Edna. She had been part of Father Divine's earlier scam and knew exactly what Jim was up to. Jim did manage to convince a few people to leave with him, but it wasn't much of a success. By this point, Jim had his inner circle of loyal followers, but he also had a smaller, tighter group called the Planning Commission. These were the people he trusted to carry out his dirty work. As the People's Temple grew to thousands, Jim needed spies to keep everyone in check, report any dissatisfaction, and make sure no one was thinking about leaving. California is where the People's Temple really took off, growing into a major political and social movement. Jim opened new locations in San Francisco and Los Angeles, and the timing couldn't have been better. In San Francisco, they set up in the Fillmore district, a mostly black, low-income area. The city had recently forced over 10,000 people, mainly poor and black, out of their homes through redevelopment, leaving them upset and abandoned. That's when Jim appeared, pretending to care and promising hope. As his influence grew, San Francisco's politicians began to take notice, recognizing the power of his loyal followers. However, rather than genuinely helping the people, the politicians saw them as a way to gain more power. Congressman Philip Burton introduced Jim Jones to George Moscone, who was running for mayor of San Francisco. Recognizing the power of Jim's growing influence, Moscone quickly saw an opportunity. Soon, 200 members of the People's Temple were fully involved in Moscone's campaign, working tirelessly to help him win. Jim even arranged buses to take his followers to the polls, making sure they voted. With Jim and the People's Temple's help, Moscone secured a victory in the election by 4,000 votes. Many believed that without Jim's help, Moscone wouldn't have won. The victory not only boosted Moscone's career, but also inflated Jim's already enormous ego. He made sure Moscone knew exactly how much he had contributed to his success. never letting him forget the role he had played. With this victory, Jim gained even more power and influence in San Francisco, making his hold on the city even stronger. In October 1976, Moscone appointed Jim as chairman of the San Francisco Housing Committee. He used his position to place his loyal followers in key government roles, spreading his influence through the city's political system. By the time anyone figured out what was happening, it was already too late. Jim became known as someone who could manipulate elections, especially with Democrats. Politicians like Harvey Milk supported him, both publicly and privately. Harvey even warned people not to mess with the People's Temple, calling them weird and dangerous. Even though he sensed something wasn't right, he kept supporting him, probably because of the power Jim had over the city. Jim craved public attention. To boost his ego, he held a big banquet at the People's Temple and invited important people from San Francisco. Mayors, congressmen, lawyers, and other important figures all showed up. Willie Brown, who was an assemblyman at the time, introduced Jim as a combination of Martin Luther King, Angela Davis, and Albert Einstein. With so much power, Jim started to believe he could do anything. He started separating his followers from their families, even from others in the temple. He acted like an abusive partner, convincing members that their families didn't care about them, and only he truly loved and understood them. Jim took pleasure in humiliating people in front of everyone. He would make them stand up and tear into them, calling them useless, telling them they were nothing, and questioning why they were even there. It was the kind of abuse that left people in tears. As this was happening to the followers, Jim was thriving in San Francisco. He had control over politicians, socialized with the city's elite, and acted like a powerful, untouchable leader. But like everything else for Jim, his power began to fade. Slowly, but steadily. The signs were there, and what seemed unbreakable started to fall apart. In 1972, the first negative press about the People's Temple surfaced. Lester Kinsolving, a religion editor for the San Francisco Examiner, wrote a series of 8 articles exposing Jim Jones. He accused Jim of abusing power, unethical behavior, stealing money, and exploiting people's faith. One of the most shocking claims was that Jim said he could raise the dead. Kinsolving also mentioned that Jim always had armed guards with him. Back then, with no social media, Jim couldn't send his followers to attack Kinsolving online. Instead, they flooded the Examiner with letters demanding the articles be retracted. Of the 8 articles, only 4 were published. It seemed like the Examiner faced pressure from both temple followers and Jim's powerful political connections. In 1973, the first group of members left the temple. 8 people wrote a letter explaining why they left. They criticized Jim's hypocrisy, pointing out how he preached equality but kept a mostly white inner circle. They also mentioned how favoritism was based on money. Those who brought in more had special treatment. Despite leaving, they didn't fully blame Jim. They mainly blamed his inner circle, accusing them of holding him back and maintaining a strict hierarchy. In the letter, they still praised Jim, saying he had inspired them and that he made them believe anything was possible. It was clear they were still afraid of him, or maybe still believed in him to some extent. Their departure caused chaos in the temple. People began gossiping, and Jim grew increasingly paranoid. He blamed his planning commission for not noticing the warning signs. Jim got really angry and demanded even more control over everyone. From then on, nothing could happen without the leadership knowing about it. Around this time, Jim started feeling that San Francisco, and maybe even the US, was no longer safe for him and his followers. The bad press and people leaving the temple made him paranoid. He decided they needed a new place, somewhere isolated where no one could bother them. He leased 3,800 acres of land in Guyana and began building what he called the Promised Land, which would later become known as Jonestown. He promised his followers a peaceful life, free from oppression and judgment, where they could work and live in harmony. He told them the bad press and conspiracy theories against the temple were attempts by the US government to destroy their vision of socialism. This helped him keep his followers loyal and motivated. For Guyana, welcoming the temple served a strategic purpose. The country, which had recently gained independence from Britain, was in a territorial dispute with Venezuela. They believed having Americans at the border would make Venezuela think twice about attacking, fearing the US might strike back. The temple acted as an unofficial human shield for Guyana. On August 1st, 1977, a groundbreaking article written by Marshall Kilduff and Phil Tracy was published in New West magazine. With the help of 10 former temple members, the article exposed the abuse and corruption happening behind the scenes at Jim's church. It also called for an investigation into him and the temple. Just before the article was published, the magazine's editors reported a break-in at their office. The only thing disturbed was a file on their computer about the People's Temple. However, it turned out there was no break-in. A staff member had accidentally knocked into the computer while climbing through a window after borrowing keys. Still, the rumors of a possible break-in made people even more curious about the article. When the story was released, it attracted a lot of attention. Many politicians who once supported Jim distanced themselves from him, except for Willie Brown, who continued to stand by him. Meanwhile, the custody battle between Grace and Tim Stowen over their son John Victor was gaining public attention. Tim was speaking out everywhere, making sure people knew what was happening. Knowing the article was about to drop, Jim quickly flew to Guyana, taking John Victor and about 1,000 of his followers with him. Jonestown wasn't ready for such a large group. It had taken 6 months just to build a road through the jungle, and there wasn't enough housing or food for everyone. Jim brought his children and his trusted assistant, Carolyn Layton, but left his wife, Marceline, in San Francisco to manage things there. At first, life in Jonestown seemed like a fresh start. People were excited about the idea of living in the jungle, working hard and growing their own food. While some found aspects of life there enjoyable, many were disappointed when they arrived to find a thick, hot, mosquito-filled jungle instead of the tropical paradise they had been promised. The settlement was overcrowded, with many people squeezed into tight spaces. Long lines for the bathroom were common, and the showers were basic outdoor setups. To make matters worse, the water wasn't safe to drink. Meanwhile, Jim enjoyed a spacious private cabin equipped with a refrigerator, a bed, a fan, and other comforts that he kept to himself, separate from the others. He lived there with Carolyn Layton and another woman, Maria Katsaris, along with John Victor Stowen. At the same time, his mindset began to shift. Jim grew increasingly paranoid, believing the U.S. government was coming after him. He had guns shipped secretly to Jonestown, using the code word Bibles to avoid raising suspicion. Things were getting tough financially. The U.S. Social Security Office stopped sending checks to elderly temple members, which was a major source of income for Jonestown. It cost $600,000 a month to run, and Jim's plans weren't working. As a result, the atmosphere in the settlement began to change. When new people arrived, their luggage was searched, and anything valuable, like jewelry or money, was taken and sold. The punishments in Jonestown got more severe and cruel. They had a punishment system called the box, an isolation chamber used for people who misbehaved. They also dug a pit in the ground to throw people in. Public humiliation got even worse. One woman, who was terrified of snakes, was forced to hold an anaconda. Her hands shook as the snake wrapped around her and she was terrified. But instead of helping her, everyone just laughed and made fun of her fear. At night, the meetings would go on for hours. People worked all day starting at 6 a.m. and then had to sit through these long, exhausting meetings. During the meetings, Jim would read fake stories from U.S. newspapers, claiming that the Ku Klux Klan, a white supremacist group, had taken over. He would tell them that children were wearing white hoods and black people were being sent to concentration camps. To make sure his followers stayed convinced, Jim continued to manipulate their perception of the world. Occasionally, representatives from the Guyanese government would visit to check on things. However, Jim carefully staged these visits to create the illusion of order and peace, despite the chaotic reality behind the scenes. He carefully staged everything for the officials, showing off the best parts of Jonestown. He had rehearsed members speak positively and treated the visitors to lavish meals, even though most of the community was hungry. However, Jim treated visits from the U.S. Embassy very differently. He viewed them as the enemy. By late 1977, families in the U.S. had flooded the State Department with letters and calls, worried about their loved ones in Jonestown. As U.S. officials started visiting more often, Jim claimed it was all religious discrimination. He even threatened lawsuits, saying they wanted to practice their faith. Eventually, the U.S. and Guyanese governments started backing off, deciding it wasn't worth the conflict. However, Leo Ryan wasn't convinced. He didn't believe that everyone in Jonestown was there willingly. After talking to former members, he became determined to investigate. The stories he heard didn't match the perfect image Jim portrayed. Ryan decided to visit Jonestown himself to see if people needed help. As Jim's fear and distrust grew, he began making plans for what he called the final White Night. These White Nights were practice drills for mass suicide, repeated 82 times over a year. Jim began introducing the idea subtly, often hinting at the possibility, suggesting that dying might be better than letting outsiders take their children. Over time, the rehearsals became more extreme. During these drills, Jim would bring out containers of red liquid and tell the group it was poison. He told them it would take only 45 minutes for all of them to die, using these moments to create fear and test their loyalty. Many of Jim's followers from California had already experienced the poison drills, so when they drank the red liquid during this latest drill, most assumed it was another test. Afterward, Jim revealed it was merely a loyalty test and praised them for passing. As a reward, he announced they could take the rest of the day off. The group, drained and confused, sat in stunned silence, struggling to process what had happened. The next morning, Jim handed out paper and asked everyone to write about how they would have felt if this had been the actual White Night. Soon after, Jim instructed Larry to purchase a pound of cyanide for $8.85, enough to prepare 1,800 lethal doses. Although the plan was becoming more evident, Jim still did not disclose his true intentions to his followers. Instead, he continued to claim that negotiations were ongoing with Russia to relocate the group there. He described the White Night as merely a backup plan, despite the fact that Russia had no interest in hosting them. While Jim kept his followers distracted with false hopes, Tim Stone continued his legal battle against the temple. Determined to fight, Tim filed one lawsuit after another, refusing to back down. Meanwhile, Jim found himself trapped, unable to return to the United States without facing arrest and knowing that ignoring the lawsuits would also result in a warrant. His options were running out, and the pressure was mounting. Before Leo Ryan even arrived in Jonestown, Jim was already planting seeds of fear and paranoia among his followers. He told them Ryan was sneaking around at night, planning to destroy their community. Jim painted Ryan and his group as enemies, calling them names like communists and degenerates and accusing them of being against Christ. He even suggested that if it came to it, they might have to kill Ryan, or even children, to protect their way of life. On November 14, 1978, Ryan arrived in Georgetown with his team, which included staff, reporters, and relatives of Jonestown members. The U.S. Embassy told Ryan he was on his own, and the Guyanese government didn't want to get involved either. They'd already investigated and found nothing wrong, and didn't want to risk a lawsuit for religious discrimination. Jim initially refused to let Ryan visit, especially after hearing he brought defectors and reporters. But Marceline, frustrated, urged him to allow it, arguing it was better to let people leave peacefully. Her words worked, and Jim reluctantly agreed. When Ryan and his group arrived in Jonestown, they interviewed residents who mostly claimed to be happy. That night, Jonestown held a feast filled with singing and dancing to show outsiders how happy life was in the community. During the event, Vernon Gosney secretly slipped a note to NBC reporter Don Harris, pleading for help to escape. When Harris accidentally dropped the note, a nearby boy spotted it and raised the alarm. Vernon quickly picked it up and handed it back, pretending it had been dropped by mistake, but he was terrified, knowing the danger they now faced. Later that night, as tension grew, 11 residents made a daring escape, slipping through the jungle under cover of darkness. The next morning, Marceline gave the press a tour of the compound, showcasing the facilities to create the impression of a thriving community. Meanwhile, Ryan and his assistant, Jackie Spire, met with residents who wanted to leave and recorded their statements. Jim, visibly furious after hearing about the escape, finally showed up and was confronted by Ryan about the note and others wanting to leave. Although Jim insisted people were free to go, it was clear he was losing control. More residents stepped forward to leave, sparking anger among Jim's loyal followers, who began shouting and threatening the defectors. The situation was rapidly unraveling, and Jonestown was on the brink of chaos. The next day, 15 more people joined the escapees, and Jim's lawyers tried to downplay the situation. But Jim was increasingly worried. As the defectors prepared to leave, Larry joined them, which raised suspicions. However, they didn't pay much attention to it and began their long, difficult journey to the airstrip. Soon after, a truck with armed men headed toward the airstrip to stop the group. At the airstrip, 2 planes were ready, but not everyone could fit, creating tension among the defectors and media. Larry's true intentions were soon revealed. He had planned to kill the pilot mid-flight, ensuring everyone would die. As the group argued over who would board the planes, the truck carrying the armed men arrived, and they immediately opened fire. Amid the chaos, Larry pulled out his gun and started shooting as well. People scrambled for cover, some running into the woods and others hiding behind the planes. Those who couldn't escape were caught in the gunfire. When the shooting stopped, the aftermath was horrifying. 5 people were dead, including Leo Ryan. Jackie Spire was critically injured but still alive. The planes meant to save them took off, leaving the dead, the injured, and the survivors stranded on the airstrip. It was too dangerous for rescue teams to arrive at night, so the survivors were left to tend to the wounded and wait for help. Back at Jonestown, Jim called everyone to the pavilion for a meeting. Jim frantically tried to justify what was about to happen, warning his followers that once news of the killings at the airstrip reached the outside world, outsiders would invade Jonestown. He painted a grim picture, claiming they would come armed, take their children, and kill everyone. He urged them to act quickly, insisting it was better to end their lives on their terms rather than face destruction at the hands of others. Initially, many believed this was just another rehearsal, similar to the numerous white nights they had endured, where Jim had tested their loyalty through staged mass suicide drills. Doubt began to spread when someone in the crowd questioned why they weren't planning to flee to Russia as Jim had previously suggested. He dismissed the idea, declaring that it was no longer an option given the circumstances. Another voice from the crowd pleaded for hope, arguing that as long as they were alive, there was still a chance for survival. Jim, however, ignored the plea and continued pushing forward with his plan. Soon, nurses appeared with syringes and barrels of poisonous liquid. Jim announced that the children would be the first to go, and that parents who wished to die alongside their children could join them. Panic spread through the crowd as people cried, screamed, and begged for it all to stop. Jim refused to listen, insisting it had to be done and urging those who hesitated to drink the poison. He showed no mercy, pushing others to force those who resisted. What had started as a choice had turned into a horrifying act of mass murder planned by Jim. Marceline made one last attempt to stop him, begging him to end the killings. However, her resistance was met with indifference. Jim coldly informed her that her children were either already dead or soon would be, leaving her with no reason to continue living. Armed guards surrounded the pavilion, ensuring no one could escape or resist. The children were the first to die, their agonizing deaths confirming the grim reality of the situation. Adults were forced to follow, some still clinging to their misplaced trust in Jim, while others, overwhelmed by fear and despair, saw no way out. Those who resisted were forcibly injected with the poison, and chaos consumed the pavilion as hundreds perished. Throughout the massacre, Jim continued to speak, occasionally pausing to give orders or pressure others to comply. By the end, over 900 people, including children, had lost their lives. Jim did not take the poison himself. Instead, he died from a gunshot wound, though it remains unclear whether it was self-inflicted or if one of his guards fired the shot. Among the first to die was 6-year-old John Victor Stowen, whose parents Tim and Grace Stowen had fought relentlessly to save him. Despite their efforts, they were unable to protect him. He was one of many innocent victims lost in this senseless and tragic event. What do you think led so many people to follow Jim Jones so blindly? Could more lives have been saved if authorities had acted sooner? How can we learn from this tragedy to prevent similar events in the future? Share your thoughts and comment below. Thank you so much for watching the entire Jonestown series. I hope it helped shed light on the tragic events that unfolded there. I'm excited to let you know that my next video series will be about the Manson family, another dark chapter in history. Subscribe and press the bell icon so you don't miss it. Thank you so much for your support. It really means a lot.